I mean, when we look at people's happiness in their relationships versus like the comparison with the amount of people that they've had intimate relationships with, there tends to be a lot of variation in the long-term happiness or success of a relationship.
You talking marriages?
I'm sorry?
You mean like marriages?
I believe the last time I looked at the statistics, it was looking at people who were in marriages. So on the lower end of the spectrum, if you tended to have less bodies, and I believe the number is somewhere between like 1 to 3, you tended to have less successful marriages. And then as those numbers kind of get up a little bit and a little bit, those are where you kind of, it stabilizes, you get like more happy, more successful marriages or relationships. And don't cite me on the marriages thing. It could just be relationships. It's been a while since I've looked at that data. But then on the other end, where you get into the, the higher numbers, what people would call more extreme numbers, more, more promiscuous people, their marriages also tend to be less happy. So on both ends of the extremes, you tend to have less happy marriages. And then somewhere in the middle, you tend to have, more happier marriages or relationships. Those relationships are more successful.
Yeah, I think I'm familiar with what you're citing. I think, now, again, don't quote me either because we don't have the data in front of us, but right. I believe that this was based around marriage. And now, you're not talking about Pew. You're talking about, I think there's a specific study on that. I just can't think of what it is. I'm sure we could pull it up or have Brian pull it up. But did this account for secular versus non-secular marriages?
For what? Sorry, what was the word?
Secular versus non-secular. So like religious marriages versus non-religious.
I wouldn't know. We'd have to look at the data.
Yeah.
Because once again, I'm not even sure if they were talking about marriages.
Well, can we agree that at least according to modern data and including Pew Research did a bunch on this as well, that people who are in highly religious marriages, they tend to divorce less than people who are not in highly religious marriages?
Sure. Yeah. There might be factors that account for that. Like maybe it's looked down upon in their culture to get divorced, even if you're going through something difficult like abuse. Because just to get clear on this, you think that people who are being abused should leave their partner, right?
Depending on severity, not necessarily the first order, but if there's, depending on severity.
Do you think that people who are being physically abused should leave their partners?
Again, it would
same answer.
It would depend on severity.
Okay, so you think even if there is physical abuse present, that someone should
I think
stay?
that two people can get drunk, right? And like a woman can smack a dude in the back of the head. That would be considered physical abuse, and then just never do it again the rest of her life. I'm not going to tell that woman to like run out on her marriage. Right? I don't, or tell that guy like, oh, something like that. Or here's another thing that's really common. So, you see this in just normal relationships all the time. Like a guy will make a snide comment, and like, let's say they're watching a movie or something, he'll make a snide comment, and the woman will kind of like smack him on the arm, you know what I mean, or something like that.
Right.
Is that physical abuse? No. I guess it could be considered that. Not. So, but it's severity. It's up to severity.
I don't know that I would call it in a case of abuse. Like if you were messing around with your wife and she like smacked you upside the head as a joke, I don't think you would call that abuse. I don't think
I
most
wouldn't
people
call
would
it abuse.
Right.
I wouldn't.
Okay, so just for the sake of this conversation, actions that weren't intended to be
Again, I
harmful.
think it depends on severity.
Okay. Well, I think for the sake of this, we can exclude those cases. We can exclude the cases where someone just like
I still think
jokingly pushes you.
Yeah, I still think that it would depend on severity. Like, I also think a woman can get really, really upset, and one time she slapped her husband because she was so upset. Or let's say she threw a plate across the room and it broke. Okay. Something like that. I think that there's some of these things are pardonable and you can work past them. I don't think that those are necessarily they could be red flags for sure, but I'm not going to tell a person that they need to give up on their marriage over them.
Sure. Do you think most cases of abuse are worthy of kind of divorcing your partner? Just out of curiosity.
Well, like physical abuse, maybe. What is considered emotional abuse, probably not.
Right. We can exclude it to, like persistent emotional abuse would be something you would say you should probably end a relationship over, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. We can agree there.
Persistent emotional abuse, depending on how it's categorized.
What do you mean by how it's categorized?
Well, it depends on how you would categorize emotional abuse. It's very evasive.
Okay. That's fine. But we can just say like, you think that the most most times when people get divorced over emotional abuse, they're usually talking about those like severe cases, right? Like they're talking about like persistent.
No, I'm not at all convinced that when people say they're, especially women, that they're getting a divorce based on emotional abuse, that there was anything other than just she just wasn't happy based on other circumstances. They called it emotional abuse because it's such a nebulous term.
Okay, that's fine. I might actually be fine with that. I think there's a problem with psychology where the average person has adopted terms that are specific psychological terms.
Like narcissist?
Everyone's a narcissist now. Everyone has autism now. Everyone is, BPD now. So whatever term. Everyone's gaslighting everyone. I understand that. I think there is some truth to that. And to the extent that there is truth to that, it should be like handled and understood by people generally. But I would say in a lot of cases, that's the case where you have like severe emotional, what you would categorize, we can just use whatever your standard is.
For severe emotional abuse.
Sure, yeah. Whatever your standard is for severe emotional abuse and severe physical abuse, you would think that that would be more likely to be covered up in, let's say, like religious families, right?
No,
where there's...
I don't think it's more likely. In fact, I think that the reason it works is because you're more likely to get help. So because you have an ecclesiastical structure and traditional church functions, you have a community which is there that's able to actually assist inside of these relationships for these problems that come up, whereas a lot of other people don't have resources or they have secular resources. So
you think that... Okay, I mean, maybe that's like an empirical claim, once again, because it's kind of hard to just say that like, oh...
Well, there's a lot of good evidence for this. So the fact of the matter is that you would just logically agree with this probably, that if you have community which you can turn to for assistance in your marriage, that's probably better than not having a community to turn to for assistance in your marriage.
Yeah,
that's
of course,
probably always the case.
But if that community reinforces ideas that like, men are supposed to have power over women and in sometimes a physical sense.
That shouldn't be problematic if within the view of the religion, both partners believe that.
Right. Sorry. I'm going to wait for him to do that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
You're like scaring me.